Hello, everyone in this wonderful, amazing world. Today, I am excited to bring you a conversation with David Crow, founder of Floracopeia. He's an herbalist, he's a practitioner of Tibetan and Chinese medicine. This guy has so many talents, so much deep knowledge. We dive into the Vedas and the meaning of the word Soma. We talk about difference between Tibetan and Chinese medicine. David tells us about his time in Nepal and Tibet and all of the great teachers that he's worked with through the years. We also discuss his very insightful meditation techniques, which I thought were amazing. And he gives us a live lesson on the podcast, which is a beautiful offering for everyone. David's a really interesting guy, ton of fantastic information about plants and how to use plants to heal. You all know that I love plants, and we found a real connection and synergy in our different approaches to plants, but our excitement about bringing plants to the world. Sit back, relax, enjoy this great conversation with David Crow. David, welcome to Cura Medicina.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting
So,
me.
of course, so good to have you here. We have a lot of similarities, even though I don't know you. Just kind of reading about your journey and feeling your energy. Yeah, just we're like two brothers that found each other, and very excited to have you here.
Likewise, thank you.
Yeah. So maybe, how do you describe yourself if you were to, um, you know,
Uh,
just, yeah, go for it.
in general, I try not to, but, uh, you know, um, I guess my primary interests are really the intersection of two, vast fields of study and practice, which are medicine and spirituality. And my medical training is classical Asian originally. I became licensed in California in the early '80s, and the first wave of Westerners to study Chinese medicine. So that's how I got started, was with clinical practice in Chinese medicine, which is acupuncture and herbal medicine. But I was very interested in the deeper roots of where these traditions came from. And Chinese medicine, of course, has deep origins with Taoism and deep links with Taoist alchemy and meditation and Qigong and all these practices. But at the time that I was in San Francisco, in my first clinical practice, I also met the Tibetan yogi Kalu Rinpoche, the elder, Kalu Rinpoche, the elder, who was the real thing. You know, he practiced like Milarepa, true Himalayan yogi in the snow caves. And I was very affected. You know, he made a big impression on me, and I became interested in Tibetan Buddhism and spent quite a bit of time with him and his community of Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. Started meeting a lot of lamas and doing Tibetan Vajrayana practice and doing learning about Tibetan medicine. And so what I found was that Tibetan medicine had these spiritual roots much more intact than what had happened to Chinese medicine. And so I got interested in studying Tibetan medicine, but there was nothing available at all. And there were a lot of complications to actually go and study it. So I ended up making some contacts in the Tibetan Buddhist community in San Francisco and did some inquiries. And at one point, I just decided, well, I just have to go and see what I can find. So I closed my clinic and moved to Kathmandu, and I had no idea what I was going to find. But it was a very karmic thing. A lot of synchronicity happened, and within 1 week, I had found my teacher of Tibetan medicine and the only translator in all of Nepal who could work with us because he was, fluent in English and Tibetan medical language and had studied as a Tibetan doctor. So I started an internship, a classical internship with Dr. Ngawang Chopal, and lived there in the village of Bodanath, the Tibetan Buddhist community, and studied Tibetan medicine. And I was his first uh, Western student, and as far as I know, the only. And I stayed 1 year the first time, and then went back many times. Studied a total of almost 3 years with him on and off, and also met a total of 10 teachers in Kathmandu. The other 9 were Ayurvedic practitioners. And so I had the good fortune of actually having a really classical kind of internship training. This is back in the 80s, and there was nothing like that here. And this was even before the internet. And so I was spending time with my teachers and their students, like the lamas, actually harvesting herbs and chopping roots and making medicines and things like that. And it was a real classic kind of education. And I was bringing it back periodically to my practice in Southern California. And then it graduated from there. I started taking people also to study Ayurvedic medicine and Tibetan medicine over the years. But then it started to kind of grow into other major areas. And I was very affected by what I was learning spiritually and what I was seeing as far as what was happening to society and to the environment. And one of the big turning points for me was that my teachers were telling me that they couldn't get these herbs anymore because of overharvesting or loss of habitat and so forth. And I became very acutely aware that plant medicine was disappearing, and so started bringing this vision of protecting the plants and protecting biodiversity back to my work in Southern California, and that started into this whole series. The next phase of work was really involved with school gardens and community gardens. And I spent many years starting and working in a number of projects around the country. Some of them are still going, like the Learning Garden at Venice High School is now over 20 years. It's been going, and I founded that. And we were bringing in the opportunity for the high school kids to get out of the classroom and plant their own gardens and so forth. But we were also doing collaborations with the acupuncture colleges in Los Angeles. And so the acupuncture students who are trained also in Chinese medicine and Chinese herbology were coming to the garden to actually learn how to grow Chinese medicinal plants. So there was that phase, and then that kind of grew even further into a company that I founded called Floracopeia, which was one of the first of the green businesses, actually, that was founded over 20 years ago. And it was this idea of supporting um, ecological production of natural products. And I worked with distillers all over the world and traveled all over the world setting up distilleries for essential oils, for aromatherapy products. And I went back to Asia doing that after I had made 6 trips to Nepal to study medicine. Then I made 6 trips to India, extended trips where I was working with one primary mentor there who was a chemist who also was a distiller and who had this vast network of projects that he was doing with farmers all over India to produce aromatic plants and produce essential oils. So I started there in India, but that work took me all over Europe. It took me to North Africa. It took me to South America. And I ended up with a fairly extended family of people working with sustainable production of aromatic plants. And then that all sort of came together. And then in the last few years, what I've been really focusing on is in my teachings and my medical practice, which is now all telemedicine. I am really focused on going back to these roots of how classical medicine and herbal medicine have always been entwined together, which is everywhere in every culture. And in my studies of Tibetan medicine, I saw it, the recitation of mantras while making the Tibetan medicines.
Mm.
And of course, everywhere they use ritual and ceremony and visualization and invocation and prayer and song and so forth to plant the medicines, to harvest the medicines, to make medicines, to use medicines, and so forth. So that's been really the culmination of the whole thing, kind of came back to the beginning of the things that I was learning in Tibetan medicine, which are really based on an integration of plant medicine and deep spiritual dharma. Like in Tibetan medicine, one of the earlier things that I learned was about Tibetan embryology, how consciousness incarnates, and therefore Tibetan medicine includes all of these different dimensions of Dharma teachings. Like in the Tibetan embryology system, they're actually talking about things from the Kala Chakra Tantra of how the subtle elements of the mind project themselves into the outer elements of nature and so forth. And so Tibetan medicine was a really good place to see the deepest level of integrating plants and spirituality together. But then that is also found in Ayurveda, Tantra, and the Tantric internal alchemical processes. Everything blends these two great rivers together of spiritual practice and herbal medicine. And that's really my primary focus, and that's how I work a lot with my patients and what I'm teaching a lot. Although now, in my teachings, I am getting into some uh, pretty scientific stuff because my focus lately has really been on uh, medical level detoxification and trying to help people who have hurt themselves from excess detox, and really trying to understand and help people understand that microplastics isn't something that you just, do coffee enemas for. you know, they're in your brain, and we've got to deal with this at a very sophisticated level. So I'm spending a lot of time researching and teaching about these toxins now, microplastics and endocrine disrupting compounds and heavy metals and particulate matter from wildfire smoke. And these are becoming increasingly urgent, complex issues in clinical practice that are really fascinating to study because there's so much research coming out now. There's a ton of research about this stuff at the biochemical level. They're researching what actual compounds from plants can turn off the pro-inflammatory phase of the microglia in the brain, for example, to protect itself from microplastic particles. So now it's kind of come full circle, and I'm really into the deeper scientific research right now, and teaching all this stuff. So that's a pretty long answer, actually. So
This is a beautiful answer, and thank you for doing all that work.
mhm.
I wanted to just travel a bit back in the story to Bodanath, which is such a meaningful place for me.
Nice.
Done a lot of time in around that stupa in
Right. Nice.
Bodanath, and I would love for you to describe being an intern with the Tibetan doctors and maybe go through, you know, as if you were, at their side and they were receiving a patient.
Mhm.
What, how do they receive them? How do they decide on, the remedies or the prayers or the mantras? Yeah, I'm just kind of interested in that.
Great. Yeah, I wonder if we ever crossed paths in Bodanath. Maybe we were circumambulating the stupa on the same full moon one time. So,
We might have been. Yeah.
yeah, maybe. So, I'll tell you how I first met Dr. Chopal. When I got to Kathmandu the first time, this was in 1987, my first visit there. I had no idea about anything there. And I just went from the airport to Bodanath. And that's all. I just took a taxi and got off in Bodanath. I had no idea what to do or anything. I eventually found a place to live, but within probably 3 days, I was sick, and that's because, of course, the Kathmandu Valley is, heavily contaminated and a lot of environmental pollution, but everybody gets sick when they go to Nepal. And I had a pretty serious respiratory infection in my first week there, which, that kinda started everything off. So I asked around, the village, "Are there some Tibetan doctors here?" And I was directed to his office. And it was just a very humble room, in a temporary monastery that he was living in with some young monks, and he was rebuilding the monastery that was destroyed in Tibet um, that he grew up in and was an administrator of. So I met him shortly after he had escaped from Tibet and had come to Bodanath and was in the beginning stages of building up his monastery again. And so I met him in this small room, and there was, a typical uh, Tibetan kind of style uh, couch there, with the cushions. And I sat down in line with several other people waiting to see him. Went into the next room, and he was sitting there, and there was this big medicine cabinet behind him full of these jars that were full of these pills that the monks had made. And the whole place was infused with this, permeated with this aromatic herb aroma. And he had a formidable presence. And I went in, and he didn't speak any English. I didn't speak any Tibetan. But he did have a translator who had basic translation skills. And so we talked, and I told him some of my symptoms, and he listened to my pulse. That's a traditional way that the doctors do it. He just took a pulse reading, and he diagnosed me as, having a inflammatory condition. It's very simple language, and he didn't have to go into a lot of details. He knew what was happening. I had the foreigners, Kathmandu flu, and so he gave me some pills. And as I was leaving, I asked him. I just took the opportunity to ask if he would take me as a student. And he said, "Yes, come back when you're feeling better." So I went and rested and took his pills. And about a week later, I went back and started the early conversations and trying to find a translator because I couldn't work with, an in depth, prolonged study of Tibetan medicine without somebody who really knew the language and knew the medical system also, because it's a complete language. So within that first week, I actually found the only person in Nepal who could do that, Sonam Topgal, and we w- got started. So in the first week, I was sick and recovered and met my teacher. In the second week, I met the translator, and we were off. And basically, I ended up living on the other side of the rice paddies, uh, overlooking the stupa, and I would walk about 15 minutes across the rice paddies every season. Every single day, I would go to the monastery, and I would sit with Dr. Chopra and with Sonam, and he would give me teachings and give me lectures, and we would have conversations. And then uh, people would come in, and he would read pulses, and we would talk about the herbs and the formulas. And he basically gave me a very comprehensive step by step classical training in a lot of the same ways that the Tibetan students get, which is that we started with the medicine Buddha. And the first tanka in that series of 70 tankas that make up the entire Tibetan iconography. And so I was trained from that system, that classical system. And he had some old scrolls that he had brought with him out of Tibet, and we would study those. And he had all these other books on his shelf that he had procured, these classic Tibetan books with, the manuscript, they're basically like leaves, piles of
Mhm,
leaves between
mhm.
two covers. And he would go through these and we would study the formulas and he would tell me what they're for and the plants. And so I got involved in a very extensive translation project because all he could tell me was the Tibetan name of the plant. And then I had to go and research, well, what is this? And at that time, there was no internet. And so I ended up investing in a huge library and spending a lot of time doing this kind of ethnobotanical research to find out what these Tibetan medicines were. So I was bringing this back to Southern California periodically, and I would bring these medicines back as I learned how to use them. And I also had some adventures when I was there because uh, I made a good friend of a young Nepali man who was also very interested in all these subjects. That was his life. And he took me all around to meet all these yogis and these temples. And, we traveled extensively in different places of Nepal and met some alchemists. And at one point, we actually stayed up in the mountains in a small village and I had a clinic, and people would just come, and I would take these medicines from my teachers, from both Dr. Chopal and from other Ayurvedic doctors. I would just take these medicines and do like a free clinic situation up there to just give things away, help people out. It wasn't a high level of medicine, but it was like simple things, for digestive problems, and everybody's got digestive problems in Nepal. So, that's a little bit more about the environment that I was in.
Beautiful. Did he, in the West, we think about plants, but we rarely talk about the spirit of the plant. So, in many of the traditions in South America, all plants have a spirit,
Mhm.
and their view is that the real power and the healing modality of the plant comes also through the spirit of the plant. I'm
Right.
just wondering if he ever spoke to you about the spirits of the plants.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it gets into some real fascinating dimensions of plant medicine. Um, Tibetan medicine in general doesn't describe it that way, but what they do describe is the interface between consciousness and plants, okay? And the way that they describe it, for example, is, um, consecrating pills. And so therefore I saw, medicine making with consecration of medicine. So it's well understood that the plants receive energy, that the plants contain prana and chi, and that they, um, are a kind of intelligence that acts in the body. But the main thing that Tibetan medicine does, and this is different than what Ayurvedic medicine does, the main thing that Tibetan medicine does is that it focuses on the consecration of the medicine through visualization and mantra. And
Hmm.
so there's this recognition that the human voice can potentize the effects of herbs. And of course, that's where, the similarity with the South American practices is the use of song during the ceremonies, that the human voice changes the effect of the medicines. So in one situation, I attended a Drup Chen, which is like a 7-day ceremony, and they were blessing this gigantic pot of uh, medicine that had been made. It was like paste, and it was up on the altar below this gigantic Buddha tanka, and there were these rows, hundreds of monks sitting in rows, and every monk had a thread that was attached to his heart that went to the heart of the Buddha on the wall, and there was this unbelievable, monastic picture and situation that went on 7 days and 7 nights because they were all reciting mantras for 7 days and 7 nights, and the vibration of the mantra was going from the heart chakra through the thread to the Buddha, and then the Buddha was blessing the Amrit, the Dutsi, and therefore it was a ceremonial type of invocation using sound and visualization. The visualization was that the medicine, that the Buddha image, the Buddha archetype, was emanating light into the plants. Okay, so there's a kind of tantric link that way, the use of sound and visualization. But there was a specific story that Dr. Chopra told me, uh, which is another aspect of this. So first we have that kind of invocation aspect, but another aspect is what we could call the ecophysiology of the plants. And this is not so much about the spirit description, but it's really about how the old herbalists used to understand the potency of the plants. And so he told me stories about how he would go with his teacher when he was a young student. And this was before the Chinese came into Tibet. This was like the real classical Tibet. He would go with his teacher into the mountains. They travel by horseback, and they would build a big fire, and they would do a homa, fire ceremony, to bless the plants in the forest that they were going to harvest. And then they would harvest the plants. So again, we see that there is a link of interspecies communication through prayer. And then they would harvest the plants. But the ecophysiology part that came in is that he told me how herbalists always understood the potency of the plant based on its flavor and its fragrance and where it grew. And so the same species, like here in California, if you climb to the top of um, one of the peaks in the coastal range, you go to the south side, and you're going to find Salvia apiana, the white sage. You'll see it growing up near the top on the south side, and that's exposed to high levels of heat and sunlight, and the plant is just totally dried out. But the leaves contain intense levels of essential oil. But then if you go over down to the other side and down into the valley to the creek, you'll find the sage growing there, and it's this huge green bush with soft velvety leaves with a lot less essential oil content. Now, this is the basis of traditional herbal knowledge, actually. They weren't doing gas chromatography. They had to do everything organoleptically, by
Okay.
smelling and tasting. And so that was an aspect that's kind of related to your question. But when you were asking, one of the first things that crossed my mind was my teacher, Dr. Narendra Tiwari, and he was an Ayurvedic doctor, and he had a special interest in Soma. And Soma is a mysterious mythological plant that was the basis of the Soma cult, the ancient Soma cult of India. And there are similarities between the Soma cult of India and the Kaikion of the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece. And both of these represent the use of entheogenic plants in a very large social gathering for centuries and centuries that was all structured. It was like the main religion. The Soma cult was actually a primary religion, and the Eleusinian Mysteries was a primary religion for almost 1,000 years. And there are a lot of historians that believe that it was all based on this kind of very controlled initiation into the use of this visionary plant. Now, Dr. Tiwari was very interested in finding out what Soma was. Everybody has been ever since because nobody knows. It became extinct. Well, that was one theory, is that it became extinct, that it was overharvested. But he had a really beautiful explanation. What he said, what I think it is, I think that Soma became invisible and that only people of spiritual purity can see it now. So he had a pretty mystical relationship to that particular plant, and he told me a lot of potential species that it might be, and he told me about all of these plants that behave very unusually that could be soma, and and he said, well, there's an entire class of herbs that you can't find them unless they want you to find them. And if you go looking for them, they won't be there. But if they want you to take them, they'll become visible. So we have all of these kind of mystical things that are very much part of Ayurveda and the Vedas, and that's because it's very closely linked to Tantra, which is very magical. And then Tantra and the Vedas all come well, the Vedas specifically come from Soma originally. The earliest Veda, the earliest written, Vedic, manuscript, is actually the Rig Veda. And in the Rig Veda, the earliest part of the Rig Veda is the Soma Mandala, a collection of 100 something hymns, chants, songs to Soma, and that's the earliest scriptural religious writings in the world. That's something I find really intriguing, that the earliest religious writings were actually songs to an entheogenic plant. So, yes, all of these things are woven in, but they're just kind of woven in differently than certainly, the South American, the Amazonian, and the shamanic traditions. But there's a lot of very old roots of shamanism that are woven into tantra in India for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about the invocation, when we made, for example, when I went down to the jungle, we made hape, which is one of their plant medicines with tobacco. And so we participated in the making of that hape. And the whole time that we were preparing it, there were prayers and songs, and it was very ritualistic. And I know that all those prayers were going into that particular um, to the production of that medicine. And as you know, many shaman, when they're making ayahuasca or other brews, they're singing to the brews, and of course, in the ceremonies they sing. So it's very similar, right? They're using their voice to activate. And I loved what you said about and then the visualization of the connection to the Buddha, right? To really bring in the divine realm into those prayers, which is usually what we're doing with prayers anyway. We're bringing the heavenly down, or we're bringing up to the heavenly. So, so many similarities. And one thing I want to ask you, I was listening to this Lama about a month ago, this Tibetan Lama, and he mentioned in this talk that traditionally there were 3 ways in Buddhism. The first one was through meditation, the second one was through dreams, and the third one was through soma. And I had never heard any kind of, plant path described within the Tibetan lineages, and I just wonder if you had ever heard that as a traditional path in Buddhism.
Well, that gets a little um, complex because the word soma has so many different levels of meaning. Soma means this plant, this extinct or mysterious unknown species of plant that was the basis of a cult that uh, has a lot of evidence was an entheogen. I mean, the experience that people were describing was that they were drinking this and becoming immortal. And
Yeah.
that was actually um, information that got out from that region. The Soma cult actually became famous in the old world because people were hearing about these people becoming immortal. And they were writing these scriptures about it. I mean, that's what the Soma Mandala of the Rig Veda says. I have drunk the Soma and entered the
Mhm.
light. I have entered the realm of the gods and have become immortal. I mean, they were writing things like that. And so, of course, people were interested. And there's some very plausible historical links between the rumors about the Soma cult getting out and the Taoist alchemists in China getting really interested in finding Soma. And so, actually, the Soma cult of India stimulated a whole bunch of self experimentation trying to find Soma in India, in China. And one of the things that came out of that was something like reishi mushroom, the mushroom of immortality, which doesn't have the same psychoactive effects, but it's a mushroom of longevity. Now, that's just one level of the word soma. Now, there's another level of soma, which is used in Ayurveda, which crosses over into Tantra. And that's where the Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism practices also can refer to soma. And this is a kind of a multidimensional meaning. So in Ayurveda, there are two celestial bodies, two primary celestial bodies that control everything in the biosphere of the earth and our physiology, and it is manifest in our body, and that is sun and moon. Okay, and so our body is designed in the image of sun and moon, which is the biorhythms of the daily cycle, the diurnal cycle of the sun, and then the monthly cycle of the moon. But this is also manifest in our autonomic nervous system because solar is, the sympathetic activation, the heat of metabolism, whereas parasympathetic is lunar, cool. All right. And so Ayurveda developed this polarity to a very high degree. And it's an example of medical cosmology. It's basically how Ayurveda as a medical system was based in a cosmological vision. And so Agni is the sun, Soma is the moon. And so Agni and Soma were part of celestial mythologies. Agni was all the different forms of the fire gods and goddesses, the fire in the hearth and the cooking fire and the fire in nature and lightning. And Agni became the digestive fire and the fire of our metabolism. So, in other words, Ayurveda started to incorporate these cosmological, mythological ideas into medicine. And the same thing with Soma. Soma was the moon, and the moon was what governed water. And of course, we know that the moon has a gravitational effect on the ocean, but the moon has a special relationship to plants also. And therefore, we start to see that the term soma as moonlight has a special relationship to plants. And plants in general are said to contain soma. And this concept of moonlight and plants and soma is very much linked to deep meditation and to altered states of consciousness, specifically either the entheogenic experience or deep states of meditation. And so, therefore, we find that soma also is very closely related to amrit, to nectar, and amrit and nectar are all closely related to deep states of meditation. And so, therefore, the term soma, which this Lama may have been referring to, is the practice of the activation of the inner soma. All right. So there's an outer soma in the plants, and then there's a celestial soma in the moon, and then there's the juice in the plants that's related to nourishing specifically our fluids. And the most refined fluid that is related to soma is our cerebral spinal fluid. And so, therefore, there's also this definition of soma as the inner liquid, the inner essence. Okay. And so, when we look at soma at that tantric level, what we find is that it's related to the secretions of brain chemistry in deep meditation, basically, and that it has a lot to do with the links to the Kundalini and raising the attention and the focus, releasing from the lower chakras and entering into uh, the brain, basically, and the cerebral spinal fluid. So, soma also means that it's multidimensional. And so, without knowing what he was saying specifically, I would say he was talking about the inner soma.
I was just thinking that what you described, I was also thinking about the release of DMT, which all of us have, right? We're all release
Mhm.
DMT all the time. And of course, is the magic in a lot of these psychoactive plants. So it's interesting that something that may have been talked about as an inner blossoming could be initiated from the outside by the plant,
Mhm.
right? It's because it's already in us. It's just, I don't know about you, but I've had very many states in medicine where I have felt that. I have felt that deep inner peace and connection to immortality, or however the ancients described it. That was a very
Mhm.
beautiful description. Thank you for that.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, they say that there are many kinds of somas in, the plant world, and the commonality is that they're all a kind of nectar that influences our consciousness, and so, the entheogens are considered a kind of soma, or more specifically, they're considered a kind of stimulant to our own soma, okay? But other plants have other kinds of somas, like, for example, rose oil. Uh, Rose oil is a real classic example of, what Ayurveda would say would be a soma in the flower world, okay? And then there are soma nourishing kinds of plants that are very, closely related to, building the ojas. That's an Ayurvedic concept, the core immunity, that's the nutritional essence. Nutritional essence is liquid, okay? And nutritional essence is very closely related to, the fluid of the, nervous system, the cerebral spinal fluid. And so these branches of medicine are all closely related. Rasayana, rasa, the juice, that is that which rejuvenates us, rasayana, rejuvenation therapy, is very closely related to nourishing our inner soma. And then there are these plants that are rich in soma. And then there are these plants that stimulate soma in different ways. And so the visionary plants would be those that awaken the lower uh, activity of the soma to a higher level of soma. So it's a huge subject, beautiful topic. Thanks for opening that up.
Of course. Yeah. People need to talk more about this. Yeah. I wonder if we could switch gears a bit and, you obviously have immense knowledge and deep wisdom in so many subjects, but could you talk a little bit about what your practice looks like?
Of
Your
course, yeah.
daily practice or any kind of rituals that you participate in? Yeah.
Well, there's different kinds of practice. I first thought you were referring to my telemedicine practice.
Oh, we could talk about that too, but I was more talking about yeah, just your personal
Hmm.
spiritual practice in a way, like,
All right.
sitting on the mat or doing
Yeah.
Tai Chi or whatever it is. Yeah.
Um, I left Nepal toward the end very disillusioned with Tibetan Buddhism because I encountered the same social nonsense that Westerners have to put up with when the gurus come. And so I was learning things that, really jolted my admiration for um, uh, gurus of all types. And it was a really good process of disillusionment. The guru fell off his pedestal. And then I had to ask a fundamental question. Well, what is in it for me? What is the essence of all of these teachings? And around that time, I came into Vipassana practice and really started to do much more body-based awareness practices. And I realized that that's the way out of all of these social conflicts, that this level of body-based awareness doesn't come with any cultural baggage. It doesn't come with any guru worship. It doesn't come with any of that, potential political problems and abuse and all that stuff. And so I went very deeply into the Vipassana studies for a long time. But I was in clinical practice and I was doing something every single day over and over, tens of thousands of times over the years, which I was listening to people's pulses. And I was, learning about some basic information medically from that. But then one day in Vipassana practice and meditation, I just decided to listen to my own pulse. And I started listening to my own pulse, and it turned into a complete system of meditation for me that was absolutely a perfect blending of uh, tantric information, inner alchemy, qigong, Taoist medicine, Chinese medicine. All of these things all came together in one thing, which was listening to one's own heartbeat. And this developed over many years into a full system of 16 primary practices that are an integration of Vipassana and Tantra and Taoism. And all these things come together listening to one's own heartbeat. So I began teaching this many years ago, and people reported that the effects of listening to one's own heartbeat produced profound relaxation. And that was an opening, because a lot of people find many aspects of meditation extremely abstract. And this was something that could take them directly into a focused meditative state, even more so than watching the breath, or even more so than watching the body sensations. But it's also a doorway into all of these mystical dimensions of the heart prana. And the heart prana is connected to the prana of the brain, which is part of our Soma network. You see, so there's all of these things we find in the heartbeat. So taught that course as a complete system. I have been teaching that now as a complete system for many years. And we just completed a 2-year intensive with a Sangha group of meditators that did nothing but these practices of listening to the heartbeat. So that
Beautiful.
has been a very big focus of my own practice because it's body based, but it takes one into all of these other uh, dimensions of visualization and prayer and gratitude and bhakti, and it's a way to study the 5 elements biologically. It's a way to feel biological unity. It's a way to experience non-dual awareness between the inner and the outer because it dissolves if we're listening to the water flowing through us, for example. It takes us into samadhi states. And so that's been my primary, the basis of my practice. But I am also very fond of a practice that is fundamental to tantric deity practice and that is also found in qigong. And it doesn't have to do with deities, but it's the beginning of every tantric practice, as you know. Uh, the tantric practices begin with this very simple teaching: dissolve the body into space. Okay, and then out of space emerges a seed. Out of that bindu arises a syllable. That syllable has a vibration, and that syllable then appears in the empty space, which is now inside the heart center. Okay, so the way that all these tantric practices go is that we deconstruct our subjective experience of reality and we enter into the space of consciousness, and then we reappear as a deity in the heart chakra, and then the deity begins to do all of these practices. And then we dissolve the deity back into empty space, and then we reappear in form again. Now, none of this is explained, and none of these things, the implications of it, are ever explored. They just say, "Oh, just okay." Now we're doing this particular mantra and we're dissolving the body. Well, what does that mean, dissolve the body? Well, that's a pretty profound idea, actually, that we can dissolve the subjective experience of having a body. And what we're doing is we're shifting the attention from the earth element of form and matter to the space element. And we're experiencing the body as empty space. And that's where we get all these terms, the prana body, the rainbow body. All of these practices are based on shifting our attention to a subtle level of what the body is. Now, that has intrigued me for a long time. And I started studying just that one step in that tantric sequence. And that one step was, what do they mean dissolve the body? And I started practicing, trying to figure out what they meant. And what it means is that we can induce a state of very profound relaxation where the sensations of having a physical form uh, dissolve. And this is also really fundamental to the healing practice. And I was helping people do this with, the warm oil massage and the Shirodara warm oil cascade over the head. And this is also what happens when people do yoga nidra, deep relaxation, where the sensations of the body vanish. One feels like they are empty space, but a person is still highly alert. That's what they're talking about, is a state of profound blissful emptiness with alertness. And so it's a neurological state, actually, because it has to be induced physically. So that's my other primary focus, is how quickly can I dissolve the body. And I'm particularly enchanted or intrigued by a method of breathing that comes from Taoism. And Taoism, the breathing methods of Taoism are very different than the breathing methods of uh, say Kundalini yoga, which Kundalini yoga uses a lot of very intense, forceful kinds of breathing. But Taoism uses very, very gentle breathing. And so the method that I like is called Xing Qi breathing, which means follow the qi, follow the qi. And all that means is that you make yourself comfortable, sort of semi-reclining, and you watch every breath very, very carefully, but you also enhance the relaxation as it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And the sign of accomplishment that they describe with this breathing technique is that the bones dissolve into clouds. And so
Mm.
I like that state. So that's the answer. Is I have those basic practices that I do. Thank you for asking.
Beautiful. Could you give us just the beginner's pulse meditation if people at home wanted to try a quick beginners 101 on how, what is your technique? Where, where do you put your hand and what do you
Right,
think
right.
about? Yeah.
Okay, well, I will give you lessons number one and number two.
Okay.
Lessons Lesson number one is called finding the pulse. And this is simply learning how to identify the pulsation at the wrist. And so this is the classical method of pulse diagnosis, where you reach around your wrist and you put your index finger at the crease of the wrist, and then your middle finger on the radial artery, and then your ring finger a little bit further up the arm from that. So it's three fingers in a row on the radial
Mhm.
artery at the wrist. And if you just press on that, you can feel the pulsation. But another nice way to do it is to put your thumb on the wrist, which means that you have your hand upside down and then you put the thumb underneath it. And
Mm,
that way you can listen to the pulsation at the wrist and also rest your hands in your lap in meditation.
mm,
But the idea is that you find these different ways of feeling the pulse, and the primary pulse is at the artery of the wrist. But with training, we can actually learn how to feel the heartbeat throughout the entire body, because it is pulsing throughout the entire body. It's just very, very subtle. So we start by just focusing the mind on the sensation of the pulse at the wrist. And we pay attention and we notice that the pulse is arising and dissolving and arising and dissolving. And then we can go into quite a bit of detail with that, or we can notice that the pulse wave has 4 phases, that it arises, and then there's a peak, and then it dissolves, it subsides, and then there's a pause. And those correlate to the phases of the heart contraction and relaxation. Now that's the first lesson, but that's actually an extensive lesson. Learning how to feel the pulsation of one's own heartbeat is an extended practice. But then the next practice, which everybody needs, is called presence and self love. And this is based on a very simple observation that our attention is energy. Our attention is prana. The mind is prana. The mind is chi. Or more specifically, the field of consciousness is a space like field of prana and chi, and our attention is that which focuses it. And so we go to the classical Qigong method, which is called Yi Dao, Qi Dao, where the mind flows, chi flows. That means wherever we put our attention, chi goes there. So now what we do is we listen, we create a triangle of 3 points. The first point is we're listening to the pulse at the wrist, and we put our attention there. We focus our attention, and we recognize that our attention is energy, and we recognize that we are focusing our field of consciousness on this one spot. But the second point of the triangle is actually the brain, because our attention comes from the brain, and the brain focuses our attention. And so the brain is looking down at the wrist. And so we establish the second point of the triangle. The brain is paying attention, and the brain is what organizes the field of consciousness into a neurological system. And then it focuses the attention moment by moment. So the brain is focusing the prana and the chi of attention onto the pulse. And then we place the attention on the third point of the triangle, which is the heart and the chest itself. And generally, we can't feel that, but we can visualize it, we can imagine it. And so now we have created a triangle of the brain and the heart and the pulsation at the wrist. And we simply hold our attention in this triangle and we notice that, okay, I'm paying attention, I'm feeling the pulse at the wrist. And the pulse at the wrist is a reflection of the heartbeat in the chest. And so what this is doing is it's actually directing prana and chi into harmonizing heart and brain together. And we're feeling this at the wrist. Now, the reason that this is called presence and self love is because our attention is our presence. And if we are present, then we are directing energy. And if we are paying attention to something, then we are present with it. Now, in our society, unfortunately, there's this tremendous emptiness of human contact, and people feel great loneliness. And they don't get the kind of presence and attention that they need from the people that they need it from. And so, one of the things that we can say about presence is that presence takes time, and presence is energy, and presence is our attention. And therefore, if we are giving someone our energy and our time and our presence, that's an expression of love. And so, therefore, what this practice does is that it takes our attention and it puts it on our own heart. And we learn how to pay attention to our own heart as if we were being present with someone. And for a lot of people, this is a total revelation. I've never paid attention to my own heart. And so therefore, we simply go back over and over again to this triangle. The brain is paying attention to the heart, and the brain is paying attention to the heart, and we're feeling the heart pulsating at the wrist. And I am spending time paying attention to my heart. And this is a phenomenal thing for a lot of people. They never have paid any attention to themselves at this level before. So from this, a lot of people have found some deeper kind of emotional nourishment and taken time to be with themselves. A lot of people, they never have time to be with themselves at all. They're always giving their attention to other people, other circumstances. And so to be able to go in and simply pay attention to the deeper level of their own self is highly nourishing, very nourishing. And people report a lot of emotional healing that comes from this simple practice. So those are the first two practices in that system.
So powerful. I love it, brother. Love it so much. I'm gonna incorporate it into my practice. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if somebody wants to get in contact with you and have a session, what does that look like? What kind of things do you specialize in or yeah.
Well, my practice now is telemedicine. I was in clinical practice for almost 30, more than 30 years actually, doing acupuncture and herbs and Ayurvedic treatments and so on. But now it's telemedicine. And people can find the details of what I do on my site. And so if I could just give that, that explains everything. It's crowconsultations.com, just like it sounds, CROW, consultations, plural.com. And there is a page that is about the type of medicine that I practice. So my consultations are based on my studies of classical Asian medicine. I draw a lot from Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. But I have also now studied Western herbal medicine in quite a bit of detail. So the primary service that I do is I create a comprehensive herbal program for people. And many people are using herbs, but they don't have the right education for self diagnosis or self treatment. And so I frequently work with people to kind of help them sort out what they're doing. I also do some pretty high level medical advocacy, I guess you could say, and deal with complicated problems because many people have to make some pretty complex decisions about medical issues. People are being put on many medications unnecessarily. And so I have to give a very educated and ethical, uh, um, position and advice about, well, your lipid panel isn't really that bad. You don't need to go on
Mhm.
statins. You don't need to risk your cognitive function because your LDL is 5 points too high. So I offer a perspective from natural medicine. And a lot of people don't want to go on medications, or a lot of people want to come off medications. And so that has to be done very, very carefully, dealing as an interface with allopathic medicine. And so I basically teach people critical thinking. So what I'm doing in my telemedicine practice is what I call teaching people how to do clinical level self care. So it's self care, but that means that we have to learn a lot. We got to learn, what do these cholesterol markers actually mean, or what is the real danger zone with these markers or not? And I do things. I would say that one of the most basic exercises that I do is when people come to me, they are frequently on medications and the doctors have never told them what the medications will do. And I recognize right away that what they are experiencing is side effects of medications. And so I ask them, did the doctor ever tell you that these medications will create these problems?" And they say, "No." And then I said, "Did you ever research the medications?" And they say, "No." And so this is probably the majority of people in the US now is the doctors don't tell them the risks and benefits and what could happen, and the patients don't study it. And so I offer that service. I say, "Well, let's just go to drugs.com and let's just put in your statin here and take a look, or let's put in your, your hypotensive medication and let's take a look at what it does." And people are shocked. You know, they immediately want to get off of it. But it's not that easy because sometimes it is medically necessary. And that's really what I'm doing is I'm offering a well-educated and um, uh, medically grounded interface of natural methods with allopathic treatments a lot of times. And that's complicated. People have to know about herb drug interactions and so on. So I have a lot of people that I help them with herb programs for going through chemo and radiation. In many cases, we can, bring down the metabolic markers naturally. They don't need the drugs. In many cases, we can reduce the medications. So I do a lot of that, and I think it's just a general demographic uh, that I work with. And I would say a very high percentage of my clients also come to me because they've hurt themselves with uh, extensive, prolonged, or harsh detoxification methods. And so that's the other side of self-education and self-diagnosis and self-treatment is that many people tend to gravitate into detoxification and then end up hurting themselves. So that's a brief overview of what I do, but that's all on the site and people can see those details. So thanks again. And also on that site, there are those courses like the
Great.
listening to the heart course. So thank you.
Awesome, and I'll drop the link to all of those resources in the show notes so
Thank you.
people can go directly to them, yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome, Dave. Is there anything else you'd like to say or parting words,
Yeah.
thoughts?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
of
It's great to meet you.
course.
Really
Yeah,
nice
great to meet you too.
really nice to get a just in our, short original meeting before we started talking, just to get some idea of your eclectic background, which is very
Mm,
similar with all of these diverse interests in plant medicine and spirituality, and learning that we had actually lived in the same area of the Kathmandu Valley, and so beautiful. It's a great pleasure to meet you, and
you too,
great
Dave,
great work
and
that you're doing. Thank you.
thank you. Anytime you wanna come up to Ojai and take a hike and talk about plants, just let me know, and
Thank you.
we'll make it happen. Yeah,
Thank you. Appreciate that.
yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate the people who tune in to these subjects in this podcast. I created it to share part of my world, and I just want you to know I have much gratitude. I would love it if you followed and subscribed to the podcast so that you could receive all the beauty that's coming your way. Take a moment and please leave a quick review. It would really help the podcast spread and would also let me connect with the people that are listening. I would love to build this community in a very mindful way. And by leaving a review, you help me understand who you are and if you like it. Wishing you a wonderful day. And I look forward to our next podcast together. Hausch, hausch.